So as this pan-tribal protest movement that starts to take shape in the 1960s uh, moves forward, it begins to forge ties between members of diverse tribes. Um, Ultimately, the successes of the movement, especially in regards to changing federal policy and policy opinion, encourages a rebirth of commitment to tribalism and Indianness. Um, we could say the same thing happened with African Americans after the civil rights movement, with a move to blackness and black power. Red power was very much in harmony with this idea. American Indians were simultaneously stimulated to assimilate into this pan-tribal idea, which stressed their common characteristics and created organizational forms that ultimately unite the tribes, which in turn retains this pluralistic relationship with the larger society. This is done by working for self-determination and enhanced tribal power and authority. So part of the significance of the Red Power movement in and of itself was that it encouraged both a pan-tribal unity and a continuation of tribal diversity. So what Native Americans found in their pan-tribal movement was ultimately what they were looking for as a relationship, as a model relationship for the United States. One of the great ironies of the strategies to relocate Native Americans across the country in different locales at different times is that what was once deemed as terrible land, desolate land, which is why Native Americans were sent there in the first place. All of a sudden, as technology moves forward, we find out that those lands that we had deemed insufficient for maintaining life all of a sudden have value. Rich in resources that would ultimately drive an industrial revolution. Things like coal, oil, uranium, natural gas are very likely to be located these days on Native American reservations. Water rights, fishing rights. Water rights is a huge issue in the West because Native Americans could easily make a first-in-time argument for water rights in the West, which that might not mean much to you, but the water rights in the western part of the United States are defined on a law, an informal law that was formalized into the Doctrine of Prior Appropriations, but essentially it is first in time, first in right, as long as you put it to a beneficial use. And Native Americans were clearly here before Northern European settlers. Woodlands, of course, that can be important to sustaining lumber industries, and wilderness areas that could be developed for camping, hunting, and other forms of recreation. So in the past, they were deemed as desolate. In the present, they're deemed as profitable, and you can imagine where it goes from there. Of course, this creates a challenge which was faced by the Council of Energy Resources, resource tribes, and they've dedicated themselves to retain control over these resources and to develop them for the benefit of the tribes. Because if the federal government gets their hands on them, they just might sell them. And that's one of the things that's happening under this present administration is some Native American reservation lands have been declassified as federally protected lands, and the Secretary of the Interior is selling off those lands. Many efforts, of course, have been focused on developing reservations, and generally speaking, they focus on creating jobs by attracting industry through such incentives as low taxes, low rent, and low wage pool of labor. Great way of attracting industry. Unfortunately, most tribes are located in horrible, horrible, horrible places. And no matter whether you have low taxes, low rents, or low wage pools, when you're living in the four corners of Navajo Nation, where there's absolutely nothing but desert, it's hard to attract a population that would need that resource and that would want to come there and work in those areas along with these people that would love to have jobs. So ultimately, the jobs that do materialize are low wage and have very few benefits. And even when they do, those higher level positions are usually not filled by Native Americans. They're usually filled by whites. So these new jobs, ultimately they might transform the welfare poor into the working poor, but their potential for raising economic vitality in Navajo Nation are slim to none. Enough said. So for many tribes, the treaties signed with the federal governments in the 19th century offer another potential resource, as they were often violated by white elements and agencies of the dominant group. We see a resurgence of tribes pursuing the trail of broken treaties and seeking compensation for the wrongs of the past. Virtually every tribe has similar grievances, and if pursued successfully, the long-dead treaty relationships between the Indian nations and the government could be a significant fount of economic and political resource. So if the tribes start winning some of these challenges to these broken treaties, which the federal government had signed historically in good faith, and then just decided to drop them for no reason whatsoever. And if they start winning these lawsuits, that puts the federal government in legal jeopardy, and it also could demand restitution for the tribes and bring a well-needed source of finances back to Native Americans. Another potential resource for American Indians is the gambling industry. This is made possible by federal legislation that was passed in 1988. Various tribes have sought other ways to capitalize on their freedom from state regulation and taxes. Of course, selling cigarettes tax-free and exploring the possibility of housing nuclear waste. Without denying the success stories, the lives of most American Indians continue to be limited by poverty and powerlessness, prejudice, and discrimination. And let me just say, ladies and gentlemen, when you're thinking your best options are the casinos, cigarettes, and nuclear waste, you are in a disadvantaged position. Things have not went well. And no matter how well you do with those, you're still embedded in very deprived areas. Oh, prejudice and discrimination. We've seen anti-Indian prejudice since the beginning, since we arrived. And it didn't really matter what group arrived, whether it was the French or the Spanish or the English or the Dutch or the Portuguese. It was all the same. Construct Native Americans as the other, dehumanize them, and discriminate and oppress them. One stereotype especially strong during the periods of conflict depicts Indians as bloodthirsty, ferocious, and inhumanly cruel savages capable of any atrocity. The irony of this, which is the same irony from the African American experience, because we did a very similar thing to African Americans, is it was the Northern European whites that were bloodthirsty, ferocious, inhumanly cruel savages capable of any atrocity. And this is very apparent in the way the genocide of Native Americans in the United States was laid out. And of course, the other image of American Indians is that of the noble red man who lives in complete harmony with nature and symbolizes goodwill and pristine simplicity. I, of course, like this Native American image more than I do the previous one, but that's not totally true either. Yes, Native Americans believed in living in harmony, but were they living in complete harmony? No, of course not. There was conflict between nations. There was domination. There was advantaged and disadvantaged groups, power politics, all of this stuff existed. But the contact that they had with the white Northern Europeans was something that we really need to have an accounting for, a coming out in reference to the genocide of Native Americans and the true treatment and legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States. Of course, there's a variety of studies that have documented continued stereotyping of Native Americans in popular press, textbooks, the media, cartoons, and various other places. The persistence of stereotypes is illustrated by continuing controversies surrounding nicknames for athletic teams and the use of American Indian mascots, tomahawk chops, and other practices offensive to many Native Americans. As you might not have heard this, or you might have heard this, but Chief Wahoo will no longer be on the Cleveland Indians logo. Chief Wahoo is the screaming Indian on the Cleveland Indians uniforms. You see it on their ball caps, some of the ball caps that they use. And there has been a long struggle to get the Cleveland Indian organization to give up that logo, because it depicts Native Americans as these savages. The struggle to get the Washington Redskins to give up their logo, which is kind of ironic that the District of Columbia, where the Washington Redskins play, which is the seat of the U.S. government, actually has one of the most offensive logos representing Native Americans, that of the Redskin. So prejudice and discrimination continues, folks.